Buenos días.
Good morning. My name is Diego Herrera. I am the leader expert from the IDB. In particular, I work with everything having to do with regulations and supervision, financial issues, and more recently, we have been beginning with a job with networks for sustainability for regulators and supervisors of the financial sector. And the work that we do jointly with UNEP FI, it adds to the objectives of the development of financials that are green and sustainable in the region. I would like to first share a very quick vision of sustainability in the financial sector globally. And I would also like to do it from the standpoint of the supranational regulating entities. I think that the financial institutions have been facing very recently two large risks. One of them, all of the issues of climate risks, including those physical risks and of transition that are a reality that are becoming material through the exacerbation of the main risks of especially credit risk by the banks and the market risk in the case of capital markets, as well as in the materialization for risks that take to problems and that mandate that in the insurance sector there we have to create some payments for that. On the other hand, there we also have risks that are more endogenous from the financial system that are have to do with the social and governance issues. And those are derived from all of the operations of the financial institutions and the social externalities combined with climate change. So these risks are generated basically by the financial institutions and they can be generated by the clients. And they result from the interaction of the financial institution with its clients in the financial sector and combined with the negative externalities and can generate greater problems. And they can amplify at the same time the risks in the financial sector. So for us, it's very important from the inter-American, from the IDBs and UNEP FI, we've been working a long time to support the regulators and supervisors of the financial system. In that sense, and I thank for this invitation, UNEP FI, and I think it's very important that we work jointly together with the regulators and the development of the regulations and the public policies that would lead us harmoniously to be able to handle successfully the environmental risks, social and governance, but also those having to do with climate. So with this and with this brief introduction then, I am now going to present the panelists for today. And I will do so in a very diplomatic way, beginning with the ladies. And in this sense, then we have Mariana Escobar. Mariana is the person in charge of the work group for sustainability of the superintendency of Colombia. Mariana has over 12 years experience working in financial inclusion issues and sustainability in banking. And she's been working in important financial institutions as a consultant. Moreover, she has done so in other instances in the public sector as a director of the Department of Social Prosperity in Colombia and has worked, among other issues, with something that very well related with sustainability, which is that issue of digital front. So Mariana has important studies in Boston and in the University of Columbia, New York. Mariana, welcome. Secondly, I will very briefly go on to the continent, the other continent. We have Ricardo Harris. Ricardo is the staff leader and director of the regulation department for the central bank in Brazil. From there, then, he has been spearheading all the issues having to do with central bank and specifically with those of regulation, all those topics that having to do with sustainability. He's also been a leader in all issues having to do with payment systems, regulations, and such. Before working in the central bank, he worked in several financial institutions. He worked in issues, for example, of mergers and acquisitions, among others. He has an MBA and the certification as a CFA. He welcome Ricardo then. And finally, we have Marcos Mancini, who is a senior advisor in sustainability from the United Nations for Development. He's been working in all financial centers of the sustainability network. Among other things, Marcos handles the secretariat of the G20 for the Sustainable Finance Study Group. And before working in these issues, he was in charge as the lead of the International Cooperation Group for Inquiry, which is one of the important areas from UNEP. He's also worked, among other things, with financial groups in Mexico and also has spearheaded important initiatives at the level of the stock exchange, even with indices related with the issue of climate change and sustainability with a investment base that has grown in two digits during 2 consecutive years. And furthermore, he was the person that was in charge of the Sustainability Committee in the Association of Banks in Mexico. So we'd like to welcome him as well, Marcos. And the idea is that we can have a talk more than something very formal. I would like to begin with the experiences of the supervisors and the regulators, of course. And directly, I would like to begin once again with the order, very diplomatically, with Mariana. Mariana is a person who has been working all of these issues very tirelessly for several years, and she's been working on a series of public policies. In particular, Mariana has been working with issues of taxonomies, among others. But I would like to ask you, in this case, Mariana, for the environmental and social and governance risks first, and then concerning the climate risk and the work that you have been performing at the superintendency, financial superintendency of Colombia. And of course, in that perspective, again, what is it that lies ahead, especially with the changes made by the supranational regulating entities? Well, thank you, Diego, for the kind invitation to the superintendents to share with you your trajectory and your work in these issues. Specifically, I will begin with the last question, which is how does road been? Well, I think it's important to say that Colombia financial began in 2012, and it was developed. There was a through a protocol, and we started setting up the basis for ASDG and the investment decisions, very much liaised to many of the objectives, but that's where we set the basis. And this was a line through which the financial systems decided to start on. In addition to this protocol, there were other three commitments besides the incorporation of other the SDGs and reducing the footprints and many other aspects and all the issues having to do with communications of the progress and the green protocols, and also the design of these groups for mobilization, because this is what's led the superintendents to start this. It had to do with the deliverables, and I think that it's part of this green protocol, and we saw a growth of emissions, especially in the green market that was spearheaded by the banks. And most of the emissions to date has been spearheaded by the banking sector. And by seeing this dynamic movement generated by the capital market is when the superintendency decided to dwell into this. Now, there is an important thing. Your question about the supervisors that began to talk about this climate risk, but we see that this will expand, and we're starting to see the issues with with academia and such. So we wanted to promote was a change in paradigm in the market. There was a recognition, especially by the banking sector, of what the ASDGs or sustainability issues had to do with. But we wanted to begin as a superintendency to send you the message about this climate risk because it changes the paradigm. Previously, everything that we used to do was the perspective is how these impact the issues. Now what we're seeing is how they will impact my business. So we should introduce as supervisors this change in paradigms. And that's why we began this climate risk issue. When we started this, it was through a survey, and I always heard very clearly we included the green protocol, but we also began having the physical to transitional risks. When we went to other industries, which are no longer banks, and we're talking about from the investor's perspective, we could not ignore that they had a lagging in these issues in their decision-making process. So what we decided to do was to maintain this concept that although they recognize from international markets and included the issue of climate risk. So what we've done in integration, we have focused a lot in institutional risk because there was a lagging, and that's how we have been working with them. Soft regulation, guidelines, but also regulations that is mandatory. So we began with some practices for integrating the decision making for pension funds, which are one of the main institutional investors in Colombia. And in May, we began talking about the risk factors. These are the worlds that we have to clarify. And that's what we did with these circulars. Now, to conclude, and I mentioned it now, what do we see for the future? Well, much more money, strengthening of the integration of these issues in decision making on behalf of the institutional investors. This is what we first wanted to do, and it's aligned with international issues, and we wanted to form part of those policies and the structures of their governance and the responsibilities of the directors. And that's how we were left with these. But we know that afterwards, we have to begin with the design and tools for this management. And that's, I think, where the market is going. And we have to emphasize this climate risk because we already have some tools that can be used. And that's where we're going to go. And we have to continue working with climate risks, already have some tools that allows us to talk a little bit more about this quantitative language in decision making. And on the other hand, biodiversity, I think that's very important, very complex, but we know nevertheless very important and has liaised to climate change. And I think that it's also one of the next tasks that are coming forth as supervisors when we're talking about ASDGs and all of these with green issues with the climate front. Thank you, Mariana, and excellent. I think that what you were saying concerning the future and what is coming along is very much liaised with what YOSCO and the Basel Committee and the demands that have the accepts from the Monetary Fund from the World Bank for the certain countries. And they're considering the climate risk and ASDG risk. Let me go now to Ricardo. And I would like then to ask Ricardo something very similar. Mariana is talking about paradigm shift. Brazil is one of the leading countries in environmental, social, and governance issues, but also for climate issues. So what are those policies, Ricardo, that have been implemented in the Bank of Brazil and that somehow have allowed us to have that integration to the financial sector and also more than the process itself, whether we have, as Mariana mentioned, has there been a paradigm shift in the sector and with the regulatory issues that we've implemented?
Bom dia, Diego. Obrigado pelo
Dale,
convite,
dale,
pelo
just.
convite aqui de participar. É um prazer e uma honra. Bom,
Well,
para
thank
falar
you
um
very much
pouco
for
do
this
contexto histórico da
invitation
aprovação das
and to
regulamentações
talk
do
a little
tema
bit about
ESG
this
do
evolution
sistema
of
financeiro
this
brasileiro, a gente
regulation
precisa
from the
retroagir até a
ASTG
década de
issues
80 do século passado.
in
A
Brazil
Constituição Federal Brasileira de
in the 80s,
88 e
etc. We
posteriormente a Lei
started
de
with
Crimes
that, and the
Ambientais,
regulation
promulgada
passed the
desde 2002,
environmental laws that
criaram
was
a
changed,
base legal
and
necessária
later on they
para
created a
responsabilizar os
legal
poluidores e
basis that was
destruidores do meio
necessary
ambiente
to
criminalmente pelas suas ações contra a
include
natureza.
the environment vendors
Essa base
in
legal
their
trouxe o
actions
entendimento
against the
jurídico de que os
environment. This
bancos
legal
poderiam ser
basis, after the
corresponsabilizados
legal standing,
civilmente
could
pelos danos
be
causados pelas suas atividades
co-responsibilized
de
and
crédito.
with the damages
Então,
that
esse
were
entendimento
caused with the credit in all these
então
societies.
pavimentou a percepção de que os riscos socioambientais era uma fonte
So
relevante de
this
risco financeiro, indo
led
além
us
daquela
to
percepção
talk about
intangível do
these
risco reputacional e da
financial risk as
responsabilidade
well as the
social
tangible
corporativa.
perception
Então,
and the
já em
social and corporate
1995, 5 grandes
responsibility.
bancos
So in
brasileiros assinaram o
1995, the
Protocolo
great
Verde, que foi uma
public
iniciativa
Brazilian
na época
banks
coordenada pelo
had
Ministério do Meio
created a
Ambiente,
green
e esse
protocol
protocolo ele foi um
through the
compromisso
Ministry of
voluntário em
Environment. This
considerar
protocol
os fatores
was
ambientais
voluntary to be
na
considering the
gestão,
environmental
de
factors
ativos
in
e na análise de risco
the
de
asset
investimentos.
management
Posteriormente,
and all
esse
their
protocolo foi estendido a outros bancos
investment
privados
analysis. So this was extended to other
e a própria
private
Febraban, que é
banks
a Federação Brasileira de Bancos
and
do Brasil, né?
the
Então, só em 2008, 2009
Brazilian
foram
Federation of Banks. So in
implementadas as primeiras
2008 and
normas
9,
ESG específicas para o sistema
they passed
financeiro.
the first laws
Foram
for the
normas
financial
relacionadas ao
sector
crédito
in
rural
this
que
regard.
visavam
These were
prevenir o
related
financiamento de devedores envolvidos com desmatamento ilegal na Amazônia, no Pantanal, em outros biomas. Já em 2010 foi editada uma
to
norma proibindo os
continue
bancos de
forward
prestarem
with
crédito
investment
agrícola para
issues, and
empresas
it had to
envolvidas no
do
trabalho
with
escravo. E,
banks who
finalmente, em
started with
2014, a gente
agricultural
chegou a um
loans.
marco
And then
histórico
finally,
de
in
regulação financeira
2014,
ESG no
the
Brasil,
historical
com a
framework in
promulgação de uma
financial regulations in
Conselho
Brazil for
Monetário Nacional,
communication of
a
regulations
Resolução 4326.
began with
Essa
international
norma
issues
foi
to be
resultado de uma
liaised
discussão que se
to
iniciou
create
durante a Conferência das
this
Nações
norm.
Unidas
And because of the exposure
para o
that
Desenvolvimento
began with the
Sustentável,
United
a Rio
Nations Conference
+20,
for the
né?
Sustainable
E de um processo
Development,
intenso de
and
discussão com várias
also
associações de
from
classe,
a
participações de participantes
discussion
do mercado, da academia,
process with
de órgãos
participation
internacionais,
with
etc.
academia and where
Em resumo, essa
with
norma determina
international
posturas financeiras
agencies.
de
So
gerenciamento do
this
risco
norm
socioambiental e
determines
estabelecimento
the
das
financial
suas
sector
próprias
as
políticas de
environmental
responsabilidade
risks
socioambiental.
and to
As
establishing
instituições
their
financeiras japonês
responsibility
ficaram
and social risks.
obrigadas a observar as diretrizes dessa
And the
política na
financial
condução dos seus
risk
negócios, na
had
relação
to
com seus
observe these
stakeholders e na
in
sua
leading
gestão de
their
riscos.
businesses and the
Então, depois desse
relationship
ciclo
that they
completo
could
de
have.
supervisão, a gente percebeu a
So
necessidade de
it has to do
aperfeiçoar
with
alguns aspectos dessa
supervision,
norma
and
que
we had
foram
to
discutidos numa
perfect
consulta pública
these
que
norms that
abriu
were
esse ano
discussed in a
e
public
deve virar norma,
survey in April of
inclusive no
this
final
year
desse mês.
that will create a norm
Essas
even at
normas
the end of
criam,
this
então,
month, as a matter of
políticas de
fact. And
responsabilidade
these
social,
norms,
ambiental e climática, que soma, então, o
which
risco
have to
climático,
do
os
with
dois anteriormente
thematic
já
and
considerados pelas instituições
environmental risk
financeiras
on
brasileiras,
thematic
né, o risco
risks,
social e
basically,
ambiental, além de exigir que as instituições
that
financeiras
are
listem
impacting the
ações
financial
objetivas que assegurem
sectors.
a
And they are
efetividade
issuing
dessa
objectives that
política.
ensure the
Por então,
effectiveness of this
foram
policy.
publicadas também esse
It
ano
was
mais
then
outras
that these were
duas
published
consultas
this year,
públicas,
the two
uma obrigando as
consultations, public
instituições financeiras a
consultations,
divulgar
one
informações
mandating
sobre riscos e
to
oportunidades
distribute
relacionados aos
information on
problemas
risks and
sociais,
opportunities
ambientais e
related
ecológicos. A gente
with
está fazendo
the
isso de uma
social
forma inspirada
environmental
no TCFD, só que a
problems
gente vai além do TCFD porque a gente
as
inclui
an
as
EFD
dimensões
and
sociais e
also to
ambientais.
establish
E outra consulta
the
pública
social issues.
dispondo a isso da
And
criação
another
de um birô de crédito rural
had to do
verde,
with the
que é uma
creation of
iniciativa
a
também que a gente
credit
acha que
bureau
vai ajudar muito no desenvolvimento
that I
de
think
títulos
will
verdes
help very
na agricultura
much
brasileira.
with green title development for Brazilian agriculture.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Ricardo. Muy
Yeah, thank you
clara
very much,
la
Ricardo.
presentación. Creo que
Very
los
clear
mecanismos de
presentation. I
consulta
think the
pública
public
son una
consultation
herramienta
issues
muy
are
útil
a
para
very
entender la percepción
important
del
tool to
público
understand the
respecto
perception
de
of the
las
public
normas
concerning
en
the
muchas
norms
jurisdicciones de la
Many jurisdictions in the region have been adopting them in a more firm manner, and I think they allow better understanding the general perception of the adoption of these norms. And I think that this is a very important road that you've embarked on with a ambitious goal that has to do with environmental, social, and climate risk. And it's a great road to follow by the rest of the countries. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for your answer. And let me go now to Marcus. Marcos, for us, it's very interesting to see the dynamic that the G20 has had along it. And recently, there has been a study group created for sustainable finances at the G20. What can you tell us about that work group and how the Latin American countries and the Caribbean can be benefited from the results of this work? Because the G20 sounds like something is rather far away, and many times it's difficult to land the concepts of that G20 to what is happening in our region. Well, thank you, Diego, and thank you, everyone, for your kind invitation. I would like to address or to take a couple of topics regarding this paradigm shift in this question of yours of how we can continue with a political process that in many countries in the region are not participating in. So, on the one hand, regarding a paradigm shift, and going back a while in history, at a given point during the financial crisis of the 90s, because the G8 would not include those economies that it had to include. And in 2008, the G20 began holding these leaders summit. And we have it as it looks today. In sustainable finance issues in the G20, we have been addressing these throughout the years because the G20 would support the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, but many a times divorced from those of you can see finance and development. So it's interesting when this group was established in 2015 for the Chinese presidency as a green finance study group. The group then continued with the Argentinian presence where they expanded the mandate of sustainable finances, recognizing that we have to include other issues other than environmental through an international context. And under the Italian presidency, it was established because then they would see a value in connecting and identifying those gaps in the agenda concerning this sustainable finance ecosystem that developed, because we saw when the group began in 2006 to date, it completely changed. At the end of 2017, the network of central banks, at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, then we have the coalition of ministers of finance, many networks, the IOSCO network as well. So today, this group is playing a different role than what it played in the beginning. Many topics have been studied. China, with green banks, bonds, risk analysis, informations, and during 2017, 2018, market capitals. Today, I would say that the group is playing a role as a coordination role internationally, supporting politically all of these networks. The group, as you said it correctly, changed to a work group. So it has a little more teeth, if you will, now, and can provide recommendations of a political nature, and that has a great permanence within the G20. And this is important because of the mandates they have. The BAS group has two deliverables for this year. One is the synthesis report, studying 3 issues in particular: the agenda for sustainability reporting, tools to align the investments to the MDGs, and secondly, how to align the operations of the financial institutions internationally to the 2030 agenda. So those 3 issues are condensed or summarized through the synthesis. And the second big deliverable is a roadmap for the G20 concerning finance, green finance. And this is a little bit of a paradigm shift, and that's why mentioning this evolution of the G8, G20 Leaders Summit. The mandate is not to create a roadmap for the group per se of sustainable finance working group. It's rather to create a roadmap for the G20 in sustainable finance. And we see this in the development. So the group then works a little bit as the liaison between both tracks. And this is important precisely because for this paradigm shift, having to do with biodiversity issues, for example, for climate risk issues, we know today that it's very important to see the carbon price. For this sustainable issue, it's very important to deal with issues such as changing the legal status of nature or consideration of ecocide as something punable. And all these issues like that are not naturally seen in the finance track of the G20. It's addressed more like macroeconomic and financial stability issues, but then we could also see as a natural complement within the development track. So I think that at the level of international governance, we're seeing a lot more liaison between both tracks. Now, within Latin America, obviously, we have among countries and members of the G20, we're seeing this agenda that has positive externalities. And what we've been working in this regard in Latin America, the Green Protocol. So it gave way to other protocols in the region. The protocol in Mexico, for example, seeing what Brazil was seeing, and in the same way, the policies that are implemented right now, it will have some important issues. So this is also being spearheaded from other sides where you can have other countries as well in Latin America, such as Peru and Chile, that are very much involved with that agenda. So if it's not through that G20 agenda, it could also be done through the APEC agenda. Excellent. Yes, yes. I think that it's very important to land these issues in the region and the true problems we have in the region in different countries or the ones that are more developed. Well, then we will continue now with our next topic, which is not a lesser topic, and that has to do with insurance. During the last couple of years, EIS, which is the International Association for Insurance Supervisors, that also has, sitting in the Bank of International Settlements from the Basel Committee, and the Sustainable Insurance Forum, they issued a document to request the supervisors to integrate the climate risks within their agenda. Now, the document basically brings forth a series of questions that the supervisors have to respond concerning this climate risk about how to incorporate them, for example, in those issues of the prime and how to supervise these risks, among others, for the payment of these claims. It's important what the people have been doing EIs. And as a matter of fact, Mariana, I wanted to ask you, what has the financial superintendency's vision been regarding this document, and what is expected from the institutions that are being supervised concerning the incorporation of such risks, climate risk, etc., within your systems of risk management? Well, thank you very much, Diego. Well, first, as you mentioned, I believe that they have been coming along for several years now, preparing us for this document. IS has already published a couple of papers that were preparing us and paving the road for that new introduction. A paper that pretty much summarizes the discussions and strengthen and gives us clearer instructions. So, what is our perspective? Countries like Colombia, all of these processes have to be gradual in their implementation so that we can give them enough time to prepare, understand, and incorporate these, not only in an area of sustainability, but in a cross-cutting fashion in the organizations, which could be insurance companies that, as we all know, are exposed to these processes through the policyholders, but also through their investments. So in that regard, we have to incorporate rather these gradually. So in Colombia, how do we see that the right way to implement this would be? I think the first thing is to begin with governance and information request. And as an intern, we've been using the application paper that was published, and we began requesting information. In that regard, we first started requesting information through a survey, through risks and opportunities regarding climate change. And this is separated and structured per industry because as a superintendency, we see over various industry. And for the insuring companies, we have special questions about their exposure, their signing, the investments to climate risk, and how these issues have had to do, whether they've made investment and how they see their role as experts, at least in physical risks. And in Colombia regarding El Niño and El Niña, which are the two more important physical risks. And that's where we started requesting information. The second front that we're attacking in our work was through the issuance of the circular of a norm. This norm is the one that I mentioned originally that covered the pension funds, but that's where we began asking them or requesting, instructing insurance companies to begin from a new perspective and to begin communicating or telling us how or whether they were incorporating these issues in their decision-making process for investments and whether this was included in their investment policy. Again, these steps respond to what we saw in the state of the market that we just began with conversations, and those recommendations have to be integrated within the regulatory framework gradually. For as an authority, we have an application paper, and this became a roadmap that we considered we can continue working with this. Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with the last thing you said. And so I insist, ever since I began this dialogue, I think that the role of the supranational agencies for regulation is essential because, as a matter of fact, they offer a guideline, a roadmap, if you will, to follow for the various stakeholders, and especially for supervisors and regulators. So with this, thank you very much, Mariana. I would like to very quickly go on to Ricardo once again. Ricardo, just a while ago when you were talking about what Brazil had done in the legal basis, you mentioned about the resolution that was issued in 2014, and that formed the basis for the rest of regulatory issues that the Bank of Brazil has done. I think it would be important to hear from your side what the main results have been or the balance for that. Sí, estate listo. And how this has been done with this and whether they've gone through the mitigation of social, environmental, and climate risks. As I've mentioned, we've had to go through the central bank so we have to follow the governance structures regarding risks to follow with our business. And this brought further attention of the financial sector, and it helped us to promote the culture of sustainability and to stimulate the processes for risk mitigation. In the 2014, it led us people to take us to those information. These are the principles that were adopted regarding sustainability, and also so that we may act in a proactive way. These initiatives have been left as regulations with the associations bank. And this was then published. So the regulator then had some challenges for the supervision of the central bank in Brazil. So it had to adapt its procedure, its methodologies for acting. In the 2014, and it had to implement these heterogeneously due to some of the financial issues and in the acting of these peoples. And the great banks established a more complex structure regarding their deliverables and services offered. This public consultation of the central bank incorporated the main points of what was identified in this first cycle in the supervision of this rule. and for strides made in international issues. But just a little while ago, even after this year of the country agreement regarding climate and financial issues, especially regarding adjustments that are being proposed in these rules are, for example, first, segregation of social environmental issues. There are very clear examples. And there is an explicit inclusion in the climate sphere, which is something that has to do with regulations, with events related to physical risks and those of transition, and application to prerequisites who have established all the other requisites, cooperation markets or declarations for risks and management for continuance of business. These are the requisites that form the risks and that maintain proportionality. So these are more robust and more complex and stronger regarding to those institutions that they have to comply with the simplified prerequisites to be prudent and to make them adequate. Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo. Yes, we can see that these are important risks, and this is key for the identification and measurement of these issues. Now we are living these, seeing systemic risk with 4 countries, and I think that is the most relevant point. Now, let me quickly go to Marcos. We are left with only 10 minutes for this conversation. I would like to ask Marcos to be very quick with his answer. And essentially, we're going to focus on the impact and the way that the countries of the region can anticipate everything the work groups have been doing from G20, and as well what groups such as the one that you mentioned a little while ago have been doing, the NGFS, the JOSCA group, etc. So what can be done, and how can the financial institutions and regulators help in the future? Well, thank you very much, Diego. Well, obviously, to continue the agenda for the G20 from APEC, from the various networks, such as NDFS and the Coalition of Networks and others, it's a good start for private sector institutions, but also to remember that there are many networks in the private sector that are advancing and many times have advanced this agenda before the regulators even. Many of these agendas have been used by the private sector previously. So I believe that concerning the discussion or participation and the dialogue with the public sector, I think that these networks play an essential role. The principle of responsible banking, among others, for example, the TNFD, concerning biodiversity, and well, many of the same networks that are more financial in nature that many financial institutions in Latin America belong to, the IIF, just to mention one, but also the FIAP and the PIAB and the FELABAN. All of these financial institutions networks have already adopted this sustainability issues. And through these networks, I think that we can boost this agenda further. And it's been done so in many countries as issued by the private sector. Something that I would mention to close is the regulation of these issues is something that is emerging. It's new regulation, and in many aspects, we still don't know the impact that these regulations have had in many countries. And that's where I believe the international agencies or the multilateral development agencies will have to play an important role in the legislation that is being passed to address these topics. Thank you.
Perfecto, Marcos. Muchas gracias. Yo
Perfect,
quiero terminar
Marco. And I would like to conclude now with a very
uno tiene
quick round. Everyone has just 1 minute, please,
para hablar de uno de
to
los
speak of one or two
temas que quiero
issues.
poner. Uno
And
es
this is how it'll be. One is environmental risks,
sociales y de gobernanza.
social, and those of governance. And the other topic is climate
Y les
risks.
quisiera preguntar
And I would like to ask you,
qué
why
visión
do you see
ustedes
that in
tienen
the
sobre el
future we
gobierno.
will have these
Voy a
in the
empezar
two
al
categories?
revés,
And I will begin backwards
cambiando un
now,
poco el orden
breaking the
por Marcos
order
y voy a cerrar con
by
Mariana.
Marcos, and I will close with Mariana.
Bueno, en el G20,
Well, in the G20, then I would say that the phrase is climate first.
y así se está tratando
And that's how we're addressing this in international fora.
del IFRS.
In many other different fora. And then following these, we have the other issues.
Yo diría,
So I would say
de ESG,
the
hay una gran preocupación
ESG risks, and we have to continue with this. And so, déjale abierto.
no solo de greenwashing, sino de ESG, SDG washing. Excelente, Ricardo. ¿Cuál es tu
Excellent. Ricardo, what is your perspective from Brazil?
Desculpa, Diego, meu computador está pouco ruim
Yes.
aqui.
Sorry, Diego, my computer is acting up on me,
Você quer passar
he
pra
says.
Mariana? Eu volto na sequência. Meu computador está travando demais aqui.
Tá bom. Mariana.
So I don't know what let's continue with
Adelante,
Mariana
por favor.
first. Yes, Mariana, no cierres, no cierres, no cierres. So, okay, well, thank you. It's impossible not to react. What we see here locally, at least in Colombia, and I assume that in many of the discussions that we've seen in the region as well, is that they talk about the DSG, first of all, which is a legacy issue, but they don't segregate these with the climate as a subset thereof. And the market really requests us to keep with integration and socialization issues. In the future, I see clarity regarding the SDG issues, greater clarity that we're working with the SDGs. And it's not very clear though, but I think that's the next frontier to develop our market so that this can be included. Okay, excellent. I agree with you. Ricardo, now you, please.
Obrigado, Diego. Bom, eu acho que o risco climático,
Well,
sem
thank
dúvida,
you very much. I
dos
believe
grandes desafios que a gente
that
tem.
climate risk is one of the great challenges that we have ahead of us
Especialmente
with the
com
central
relação ao
banks, and I
desenvolvimento
think
de metodologias
especially
de mensuração
with
dos riscos
development
climáticos e
issues,
ferramentas como teste de estresse e análise
with
cenários.
the different tools and management thereof and other scenarios. And climate change is very different to the financial issues and very difficult to model.
Quando irá acontecer, não ajuda muito você olhar para as perdas incorridas no passado.
And this can help us so that we can continue working and not make the same mistakes as before. And it has a great potential to free up these impacts in other issues rather than other structural changes. And in general, these are reversible. And I think something that is more important to address, these are to have comparable, consistent data to make them trustworthy also. The good thing is that these issues touches agenda from several different international fora, and the issues that are being worked upon and that we have to arrive at. Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. And we'll close this panel with this now. I think it's been a very interesting discussion with different standpoints. And without a doubt, what is coming for the region is very interesting regarding the regulatory change, specifically for ESG. And I think that YOSCA will also issue something toward the middle of 2022, regulatory changes for banks toward the end of 22. And what YAICE has been doing reveals that we're going to have some regulatory changes in the coming years as well. So the majority of the sectors are going to be covered by these regulations, beginning by the ESG regulations. So with this, thank you very much. And UNEP FI for their kind invitation. And let's continue with the next panel. Thank you all very much.